Hello, this is the Foreign National Tax Information session presented by the Office of the Bursar, UChicago Grad, and the University of Chicago Shared Services Office. Quick disclaimer before we get started. This information is provided by the university solely for informational purposes. It's not intended to be tax or legal advice. Ultimately, the responsibility lies with you, the tax filer, to ensure that your income is reported appropriately and in a timely manner. We will take a short break for a knowledge check and to answer questions at the end of each section of this presentation. There are 6 separate sessions. Please do not share any specific personal details in your questions. We will be available after each session to address questions more personal in nature. And of course, if we are not able to answer your question in this session, or if you're listening to this session after the live webinar has concluded, please plan to follow up with gradhelp@uchicago.edu. The presentation and the slides will be made available for you in early March. For advance access, if you do complete the short feedback survey that will arrive via email after this session, you will have early access to the slides and to the recording of the webinar. Onward to the 6 steps for successful tax preparation. First, we will discuss determining your filing requirement. Second, we will discuss determining your tax residency status. Finally, we will review different income sources that you may have had throughout the tax year. We will review the tax payments you may have already made and tax forms you may have received. We will talk about filing federal and state tax returns, and then finally, additional information and where to get assistance. So step 1, determining your filing requirement. You do have a requirement to file some sort of tax return for 2019 if you were present in the U.S. as an F or J visa holder in 2019 for any length of time, or if you had U.S. sourced income during the year. You do not have a filing requirement for 2019 if you had no days of physical presence in the U.S. during 2019 and you had no U.S. sourced income. So our knowledge check for this section, determining your filing requirement. If you arrived in the U.S. on December 31st, 2019 as an F1 student for the first time, do you have a filing requirement for 2019? The answer is yes. Even if you were only present in the U.S. for 1 day in 2019 as an F1 student, you are required to file a tax statement, and we will go over what that statement will look like. Okay, moving on to our next section, determining your tax residency status. Tax residency status is determined by using the substantial presence test. This is an IRS test that they use to determine your residency. Essentially what it boils down to is you are a resident for tax purposes if you have 183 days or more of countable days of physical presence in the U.S. in a given tax year. If you have fewer than 183 days, of countable days of physical presence in the U.S., you are considered a non-resident alien for tax purposes in a given tax year. The bottom half of the slide goes into a little more detail of what is considered a countable day for a given tax year. The IRS does take into account the prior tax year and 2 years prior when calculating your countable days of physical presence. But for most of the people in this presentation, you will be focused on your exempt years from counting days toward the substantial presence test. F or J students receive 5 exempt years from counting days toward the substantial presence test, meaning for the first 5 calendar years that they're in the U.S., they are considered non-residents for tax purposes generally. So you're not exempt from paying tax or from owing tax in the U.S., but you are exempt from counting days toward the substantial presence test. J1 non-students, so research scholars, professors, visiting scholars, people of that nature, they are exempt from counting days for the substantial presence test for 2 calendar years. So, for example, if you arrived in the U.S. in 2018 on a J1 research scholar visa, your exempt years would be 2018 and 2019, and you would begin counting days for the substantial presence test in 2020. If you are an F1 student and you arrived in the U.S. in 2015, your exempt years toward the substantial presence test would be 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19, and you would begin counting days toward the substantial presence test in 2020. If you're unsure about your tax status or you don't know how the substantial presence test may apply to you, we recommend that you use Sprint Tax, which is university-provided tax software, to determine your tax residency for you. We'll talk a little bit more about Sprint Tax later in the presentation, but it's important to note that you should have already received a link to this software from the Office of International Affairs. Knowledge check for section number 2, determining tax residency. If you hold a U.S. visa status, must you use the SPT to determine your tax residency? The answer is yes. It does apply. The substantial presence test applies to everyone in the U.S. who is holding a U.S. visa status. Okay, step number 3, reviewing your income sources. We're going to talk about the difference between taxable and non-taxable income, stipend, scholarship, and fellowship income, as well as travel stipends and reimbursements. Reportable income examples, or taxable reportable income examples, would be wages and salary, so those would be reported on your W-2. Bonuses and awards would be reported on a 1042-S. Scholarship fellowship income would be reported on a 1042-S. Health insurance premiums and living expenses. Reimbursement of non-business related expenses. Non-taxable and non-reportable income examples would be things like financial assistance through student loans. You're not required to pay tax on that. Foreign source income paid to non-residents. So if you are a non-resident for tax and you received support from a foreign government or from a foreign corporation, you would not need to report that on your U.S. tax return. And then interest income. For more details on income sources, we do link to IRS Publication 525 at the bottom of the slide, which goes into much more detail about the difference between taxable and non-taxable income. Stipend, scholarship, and fellowship income. So if you received funding through a stipend, scholarship, or fellowship from University of Chicago or an external source, all or part of that income may be considered taxable even if you don't get a tax form for it. Now, some of you will get a tax form for it, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you're a candidate for a degree, you can generally exclude from your income the part of the assistance that goes right toward your tuition and required fees, as well as book supplies and equipment required for your courses. But you may not exclude from income any part of the funding that's used for room and board, health insurance premiums, or other reimbursements and expenses. If you're not sure how much scholarship fellowship funding you got from the university in 2019, you can access your financial aid information in your My Financial Aid section of your my.uchicago.edu account. And you should be able to access that at any time. However, for the purposes of filing your tax return, you want to remember that scholarship fellowship income does include funding from outside the university. So for example, if you did a summer fellowship in Stanford or another university and you received support from them, you may need to be contacting them about whether or not that income was considered reportable, whether they've generated a tax document for you, or just how they classified that income. For more information and instructions about how to file that income, you can go to Tax Topic 421, which we've linked to on this slide. But also I would recommend, if you are using a tax software to file your taxes, whether that be Sprint Tax or something else like TurboTax, you can reach out to their customer support for more help and answers if you have specific questions. Reimbursements of non-business related expenses. Reimbursements are not reportable to the IRS generally as income to a student if a student can document that the reimbursement is one of the following. And we're giving some examples here, but everyone's situation is going to be different. So you may need to do some research to determine what category your reimbursement falls into. But generally, if your reimbursement directly supported a faculty member's project or research program, so for example, if you were the member of an archaeological dig, that may be considered non-reportable. If the reimbursement was related to you presenting at a conference, so not just attending a conference, but presenting, that would be considered non-reportable. If the reimbursement was related to an integral part of your degree work, so for example, if you have to be a member of a national scientific group like the American Heart Association, or you have to attend a national training course as part of your degree, that may be considered non-reportable. And if you were traveling on official university business, for example, if you were a member of the Model UN team and you received a reimbursement for those expenses, that may be considered non-reportable income to you. Okay, knowledge check for section 3, reviewing your income sources. True or false, all income is taxable income? That is false. All income should be evaluated independently on whether or not it is taxable or non-taxable. You can go to the IRS website to make the determination yourself, or like I mentioned earlier, if you are using a tax software that's specifically geared toward non-residents or residents depending on your residency, you should be able to reach out to their customer service for a little bit more help and guidance on your specific situation. Step number 4, reviewing tax payments and tax forms. We're going to talk about tax forms that you may have already received, quarterly tax payments made, and tax treaties. This is a list of the tax forms that you may have received from the University of Chicago. If you were working and receiving wages, salary, or compensation, you would receive a W-2. That would be regardless of whether or not you're a resident or a non-resident. And those were issued back in January, and they should be located in your Workday profile under tax documents. If you received an award, prize, independent contractor income, and you were a resident alien, you would have received a 1099 for that income. Those were mailed back in January. Scholarship, fellowship income, tax treaty benefits, and award and prize income for non-residents and residents claiming tax treaty benefits is reported on a 1042-S form. Those were mailed in the last week of February, so they should have arrived if your mailing address was correct. If not, digital copies are available. You can email grad help for more information about that. 1098-T tuition statements, those were issued by the bursar's office, and those would be received by resident aliens and non-resident aliens who had provided a taxpayer ID. 1095-B insurance coverage statements were issued by the benefits office, and those would only be received by resident aliens. If you are a resident alien who did not have an applicable tax treaty claim for your scholarship, fellowship income, you will not receive a specific tax form for that income. The IRS considers that income to be self-reported, so you must pay taxes on it and you must report it as income, but there's no specific tax form that you would receive from the University of Chicago to report that income. Now we'll talk about income and quarterly estimated tax payments. So federal and state law does require that you make an estimated tax payment on all self-reported income, or if you will owe more than $1,000 in federal tax and $1,000 for Illinois state tax. And we'll talk about how to calculate those amounts in a little bit. If you don't make your estimated tax payments on a timely basis, the IRS and the state of Illinois are entitled to assess a penalty for late taxes. Non-resident aliens, because they have tax withheld at the time of payment on their scholarship, fellowship income, federal tax withheld at the time of payment, they're only required to make estimated quarterly tax payments for Illinois state. We have live links on this slide to the 1040-ES and the IL 1040-ES. These are the worksheets that you'd use to calculate the amount of estimated tax that you may owe for a given tax year to determine if you need to make those quarterly payments. Again, it's if you're going to owe more than $1,000 in tax for a given tax year. The forms themselves do include the due dates and an explanation of how to make those estimated quarterly payments. We also link to the IRS publication 505, which talks a little more in detail about tax withholding and estimated tax. You can always visit the university's tax website to view the frequently asked questions regarding estimated taxes. This is a big topic of discussion every year. For some people listening to this presentation, which is geared toward your 2019 tax year, you may be realizing now that you should have been making estimated tax payments for 2019, and you did not do so. If that's the case, we simply recommend that you pay any taxes owed for your 2019 income at the time that you file your tax return and start making your estimated quarterly tax payments for 2020 as soon as possible, and make sure you hit every deadline for that. Now the knowledge check for Section 4, tax payments and forms. You will receive a tax form for all of your taxable income. Is that true or false? That is false. Remember, there are types of income that you may receive, even from the university, for which you will not get a tax form. For example, scholarship, fellowship income paid to residents for tax. It's not something that we need to report to the IRS on a specific tax form on your behalf, but it's simply something that you must report at the time that you file your tax return. And again, if you have any questions about the amount of scholarship or fellowship support that you may have received in 2019, you can check out your My Financial Aid section of your my.uchicago.edu account. If you're unsure about the type of income that you may have received, for example, what portion of your support was considered to be scholarship or fellowship income, and you're having a hard time determining that, you can also always email Grad Help with specific questions, and they can look into your situation for you. Okay, step number 5, filing federal and state tax returns. We'll talk about filing as a non-resident alien. We'll talk about filing as a resident alien. We'll talk about filing your Illinois state tax. And we'll talk about what to do if you had no income received in 2019. If you are non-resident for tax, we do recommend that you use SprintTax. SprintTax is a software that's provided by the university for non-residents to use to file their federal tax return for free. It does have the ability to create a state tax return for you as well, but there is a fee associated with that. So if you want to use it to file your federal return and then file your state return on your own, you're more than entitled to do that. SprintTax will do a couple of things for you. First, it will determine your residency using the substantial presence test. So when you enter in your history of visits to the U.S., it will confirm whether or not you are a non-resident for tax. If you are a resident for tax, you may not use the SprintTax software to file your tax return. However, you would be able to use any sort of tax software that a U.S. citizen would be able to use. For example, TurboTax or H&R Block. The SprintTax software will also identify any available tax treaties that you may be entitled to, and it will calculate any available credits, allowances, and deductions available to you. If you are a non-resident and you don't want to use SprintTax at all, that's fine. You don't have to do that. You can file on your own using a 1040 NR. And for the state of Illinois, you can file on your own using an IL 1040. Those forms are easy to find on the internet if you just Google the names. If you did live or work in another state in 2019, you may have a tax reporting requirement in that state. It's always a good idea to visit that state's Department of Revenue website. They should have a little quiz or some more guidance as to whether or not you may have a filing requirement in that state. It is possible to have a filing requirement in more than one U.S. state. All non-residents for tax who were present in the U.S. in a given tax year have to file an 8843. If you're using SprintTax to complete your tax return, it will complete the 8843 for you. If you don't have a taxpayer ID, for example, a Social Security number or an ITIN, then you must apply for one of those during the tax return process. If your spouse is considered a non-resident, per the substantial presence test, then you each have to file your own return, meaning you cannot file married filing jointly. And if your spouse is considered a resident per the substantial presence test, then you can elect to be treated as a resident for tax when filing your tax return. So if you're married to someone who's a resident for tax, you may be able to file married filing jointly. Any non-resident alien, including dependents, must complete an 8843. So, for example, if you have dependent children and they are very young but they're considered non-residents, you may need to complete this 8843 form on their behalf and mail it in at the same time as you file your tax return. Non-residents for tax are not eligible to claim the standard deduction. There is a blanket exception for students from India who, based on the guidance that we have seen in recent years, are allowed to claim the standard deduction. And non-residents cannot claim most other deductions available to residents, including dependent children. If you're a resident for tax, if you or your claimed dependents do not have a taxpayer ID, for example, a Social Security number or an ITIN, you still must apply during the tax return process. If your spouse is considered, and this is a typo on the slide, a non-resident alien per the substantial presence test, then your spouse can elect to be treated as a resident when filing their tax return jointly with you. You do not need to complete a Form 8843 because that form is only applicable to non-residents. And if your dependent is a resident alien, so for example, if your dependent was born in the U.S., they do not need to complete an 8843, so you would not need to complete that on their behalf. As a resident for tax, you are eligible to claim the standard deduction, and you can claim any applicable deductions available to U.S. persons, including your dependent children. You just have to apply for a tax ID for them during the filing process. This is a little bit of information about how to claim a tax treaty as a resident alien. As a resident for tax, if you had claimed a tax treaty exemption from withholding, and you submitted that paperwork to the University of Chicago, you would receive a 1042-S for that income. And the tax software that is geared toward residents for tax does not generally ask about this form. So it is something that you kind of have to figure out yourself, and we provide this guidance based on recent communications from the IRS. If you are claiming a spouse or a dependent that does not have a Social Security or ITIN, and you have to apply for one for them during the process, this is how it will work. You will have to complete a Form W-7, which is the application for the ITIN, and attach any appropriate documents per the instructions for each individual that needs the ITIN. You will then complete your federal tax return. And finally, you'll mail everything, all the completed W-7s and the tax return, to the address on the W-7. They will process those ITIN applications first and then forward the federal tax return on for processing. So processing of the tax return in total will take approximately 12 to 16 weeks. That's just a historic number that we've seen in prior years. It only takes about 4 to 6 weeks for the ITINs to be assigned, but by the time that they're assigned and the return is forwarded for processing and then finally processed, it takes about 12 to 6 weeks. For Illinois state tax filing, you would hold off on filing your Illinois state tax until you receive those ITINs. So while you would mail your federal return with the W-7, you would hold off on that state return. You may need to, especially at this point, file for a state tax extension until October 15th, and then file your Illinois tax return once you've received your ITIN. For your Illinois state tax filing, we do link to a little quiz on the Illinois state tax website that talks about whether or not you may have a filing requirement. If you lived and worked in Illinois or had earned income in Illinois, it is very likely that you have an Illinois state tax requirement. If you were a part-year resident of Illinois, you may need to file the IL-1040 and a Schedule NR if you earned income from any source while you were a resident, and if you earned income from Illinois sources while you were not a resident, or if you want a refund of any Illinois income tax withheld. The Illinois state tax form references the federal tax form. So when you begin your IL-1040, if you're filing it yourself, you will begin it with the adjusted gross income created on your federal tax return. This is why it's a great idea to complete that federal tax return before completing your Illinois state tax return. If you were in Illinois as a non-resident and you did not have any income from Illinois sources, you may not have an Illinois filing requirement. So if you were present in the U.S. in Illinois for even just a day or so in 2019, you have to file that 8843 with the federal government, but you may not need to file anything with Illinois if you didn't have any income that year. Non-resident aliens can be considered residents of Illinois. The residency determination is different between Illinois and the federal government. So you would only complete the Schedule NR for the state of Illinois if you had worked or lived in another state while in the U.S. in that tax year. Now, if you had no income received in 2019, but you were physically present in the U.S. as an F or J non-resident visa holder, you do still have this filing requirement. You have to complete the 8843. It's due by June 15th, 2020. So you get 2 extra months to complete it if you don't have to file an actual tax return. And all this statement is just a statement that you were physically present in the U.S. on an F or J visa and did not have any income that year. If your child was born in the U.S., you do not need to submit this form on their behalf. And if you're using SprintTax, even if you had no income, they'll create this form for you. Knowledge check for Section 5. What is the name of the software provided by OIA for non-resident tax filing? It is Tax. That is the software that is a free resource. It calculates your substantial presence test and your federal tax return for free, as well as a state tax return for a fee. Moving on to the final section of our presentation, additional information and where to get assistance. We'll talk about prior year filings and corrections, so what to do if you feel like you may have made a mistake in a prior year, free resources, paid resources, and a checklist for the future. Prior year filings and corrections. If you failed to self-report income, for example, scholarship, fellowship income, or if you made another error in tax filing for a previous tax year, you can complete either an amended tax return or file an original return for a prior tax year. So you would file an amended tax return, for example, for 2018, if you had already filed a tax return but realized you forgot to report a certain amount of income. That form, the amended tax return form, is called a 1040X, and in Illinois it's called an IL 1040X, and you can complete that and file that at any time. If you never filed a return for 2018 because you didn't know that you were supposed to report income, you can file an original tax return for those years. Here we provide some links to some free resources. IRS does have a free file tax assistance software that you can use to file your tax return for free. This would be a good resource for residents for tax. For non-residents for tax, it can be a little more complicated. We do recommend that you use Tax, but if you would like, you are certainly entitled to use their free file system. We also link to the IRS local offices and the Illinois State Revenue Office. They're pretty busy at this time of year leading up to April 15th, so I would recommend that you call rather than showing up in person. We also recommend the VITA volunteers. These are individuals who are certified to assist you in filing a tax return. So this is generally for someone with an AGI of less than $55,000 for a given tax year. You can call the phone number listed on this slide or use the online locator linked on the slide in order to locate a place where they may be having a clinic. There are 10 sites within a 10-mile radius of campus, the last time we checked, including Harold Washington Library and Robert Morris College downtown. As for paid resources, if you'd like to pay someone to prepare your tax return for you, you can always use a certified public accountant or an enrolled agent. These are individuals who are certified to help people filing their tax returns. Not all CPAs do individual income tax returns, so I would recommend going to the AICPA.org website or the ICPAS.org website to find someone who's licensed to prepare individual tax returns if you want to go that route. Enrolled agents only do taxes. They are trained by or work directly for the IRS, and you can locate them on the website link there, naea.org. If you're going to use a tax prep chain or purchased online software, that is best for simple or straightforward returns without a lot of unique situations. And some of those chains or software, they do claim to file tax returns for free, so just make sure that you read the fine print and make sure that it is really free for what you need it for. If you choose a professional tax preparer, do make sure that they have filed student and non-resident tax returns in the past, and make sure that they pass state or federal certifying exams. You can find all that information online in the links that we provided further up on the slide. We do recommend that you get an estimated price for the services up front, including all fees. One red flag that we have seen is that some chains or enrolled agents will say that they will prepare your tax return in exchange for a portion of the tax refund that they are able to get for you. That is a red flag, and we would highly recommend that you go with someone who can provide an upfront fee before they complete your tax return on your behalf. So for the future, we would recommend that you keep a file with all your scholarship payments and make notes of the types of payments, so stipend, fellowship, wages, So you know what types of forms to expect at year end. Will you be getting a W-2, a 1099, or a 1042-S, or a combination thereof? We also recommend you keep receipts for possible educational expense deductions if you plan to try to make those deductions. We recommend you make your estimated tax payments on a timely basis using the 1040ES and the IL 1040ES. And then we also recommend that you visit taxes.uchicago.edu for more information and email GradHelp as well if you have any other questions.